welcome to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith and Charles Cote. My name is Dara Cosberg. I am the program director at Reimagine, which is a nonprofit organization that sparks community experiences like this one that enable individuals, communities, families to talk about some of the hardest parts of our existence, including serious illness and death, while celebrating life and one another. And yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation today. So before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping things to do. So first, I just want to express our profound gratitude for our 2021 sponsors who are shown here, who support Reimagine and help make this work possible. I also want to thank everyone who donated to Reimagine. We also very much depend on small, donations from our community to offer free events like this one. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass things off to Claire, who is a grief therapist, author, and I will post her and Charles their bios in the chat again in a moment, but you're in for a treat. So with that, I'll pass it off to Claire.
Thank you so much, Dara. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm so happy to see you all. I like that you've described our forthcoming grief conversation as a treat, Dara, which it will be. But I think that I just like that description. Thank you. Let's see if we can make that really happen for everyone. I'm so excited to have Charles with us today. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
So to begin, you sent me your book of poetry, I Play His Red Guitar, and it was just stunning. Each poem, I think, had a different story, but all within a larger context. And I was wondering if you could just begin by telling us about that book as a way of getting to know you to begin with.
The book was an extension of another project that I started, a chapbook that's called Flying for the Window. I started writing poems several years after my son passed away. I couldn't write them right away. It was too close to that time period. But I began writing some of those poems, and then in some ways it became an obsession at first. I had to write these things. They were a container for my grief, trying to make sense of the loss, trying to, put it at a bearable distance, I guess. And so I wrote those poems. The inspiration for the title of that book came from my son's journal. After he died, we discovered notebooks that he had, because he was a singer-songwriter, a bit of a poet himself. And there was one quote that took my breath away, that I got the title from the poem. And it goes like this: certainty is the cage that keeps us safe from curiosity. I've been released from the cage. I am the songbird, and I'm flying for the window. I know it's closed, but I plan on breaking through. And so that's where I got the title. And then I kept writing, of course, kept studying poetry. For me, poetry was a way that I honored my son's legacy. So it became a legacy project for me, which was another way that I was dealing with my grief, a way that I could honor him, the art that he did. He was very committed to songwriting and music. And so I wanted to do the same, because poetry is a passion for me, but I wanted to take it really seriously. So I started studying it, went to a lot of festivals where I had workshops with people like Gregory Orr, Stephen Dobbins, Tom Lux, a lot of big names in the poetry world, and started honing the craft, if you will, started teaching poetry. But this book, started to take shape, and there it is. So I'm not sure. I think for me, there is a bit of a progression in the poems, where there's the shock and the overwhelming experience of dealing with the diagnosis of cancer for your son and then going through all that horrendous treatment.
How old was he when he was diagnosed?
He was 16, but it turns out that he had it when he was 14 because he had a mole on his head that he discovered. And then, we had it biopsied and we were told it was benign. And then 2 years later, we find out he had a lymph node that, was sticking out or was swollen. And we found out that that was melanoma. So then the poems kind of go through this transition then to dealing with his death to then dealing with life after his death. So that's kind of the progression. And hopefully it, kind of moves towards transformation, towards, some kind of renewed perspective, and really a celebration of his life. The word elegy, it contains two elements. It contains the sadness or the lament of the loss, but it also the celebration of the person's life and in general, the celebration of life. So that's kind of what's that. Yeah. Would
you read us a poem?
Sure. I'll read a poem called on the first anniversary of your death. And just a little backstory on this. This is based on an experience I had a year after he died. And I went back to the place where I was born in North Adams, Massachusetts. And the very first place my father ever worked was at Sprague Electric. And Sprague Electric, which was just down the street from where we lived, turned into the Museum of Contemporary Art, MoCA, Mass MoCA. So I was in Mass MoCA and I saw this installation by a Chinese artist, and one in particular stunned me, so I'll read it to you. On the first anniversary of your death. Crouched in the middle of a room, I see a 15-foot beast, the front half a wolf, the back half a whale, bottom jaw fished hooked to an iron crucifix 6 feet in length, both cross and hook, a 5-foot Christ hanging from the horizontal shaft. Looking up past the hook's eye, 7 2-foot bobbers shaped like sitting Buddhas, chain linked to suggest a line suspended from the ceiling. Near the rafters hangs the fisherman, a standing Buddha holding the pole. Here I am in the middle of all this, where once my father worked at the electric plant, now Museum of Modern Art, in the town where I was born near the Hoosick River. Across the street, the church where I was baptized in school, the place where nuns taught history and catechism, cracked wooden rulers on guilty knuckles, where priests invoked the pale body of Christ in wafers and washed him down with wine, a Jesus so small he was popped in the mouth and melted. How could something that small help now in the middle of this room near the jaws? And I think I've been swallowed past teeth, tongue, and throat, down the gullet into darkness, toward Jonah's ragged fluke.
Thank you. You and I have some interesting crossover. We're both psychotherapists, both writers, both grief. Where do you see the intersection of those things for yourself, particularly, psychotherapy and writing? I was a writer before I was a therapist. Sounds like you may have been a therapist before you were a writer. I mean,
exactly. That's true. I used to be afraid of writing, but being a therapist actually compelled me to be a writer because I needed an outlet, some way of speaking about my experience or, something like that. Because as a therapist, we absorb a lot of pain and suffering and confusion, and we're asked to help people make sense of it. Our job is to make sense of the sense that people are trying to make of their lives. And so for me, writing is a way of doing that. It's a way of encountering myself, discovering things, perhaps like Robert Frost said, discovering things that I didn't know I knew until I started discovering it through writing. And that's, for me, one of the joys of writing. But as a therapist, I think we're always looking for ways for people to put things in perspective, to find a way to contain the chaos of their life. And I think the art of poetry, lyric poetry in particular, I think, and then the I poem, writing in the first person, can do that. I suppose it's like journal writing in some ways. Your memoir in some ways, which is beautiful, by the way. The Rules of Inheritance, everybody, go get it. It's amazing. I can't put it down. Yeah, you tell me, what's it like for you? Where do you see the crossover?
I think that in my work with clients, we spend so much time exploring narrative and the stories that they tell themselves, the stories that they tell about their lives and about the things that happen to them. And then I think we spend a fair amount of work kind of reframing those stories or deconstructing the narrative or reconstructing it. And so that for me has so much crossover with writing. I feel like having been a writer for such a period of time before becoming a therapist really helped me, especially kind of piece together people's stories and help them look at them in new ways. So that's what I think about it too.
Well said. I like that, deconstructing the narrative or reconstructing it, building out a bigger perspective or a new perspective. I like that in terms of writing, because you write something with a certain kind of creativity or inspiration in the moment, but then you go back to it later and you look at it with a more critical eye, and you might deconstruct it or reconstruct it and then find out, like Stephen Dobbins would say, what is this about first? And then how is it about that? How is it about it as well? Because you're trying to find its essential form or its shape. So I like that about poetry in particular. And, I wonder if, prose writing has similar elements to it for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Writing has always helped me understand and explore whatever's happening, whether it's what's going on in my life or my clients. I'm wondering, had you worked with people who were grieving before you went through the loss of your son?
Yeah, I think probably everybody that comes into therapy is dealing with grief at some level, dealing with loss, trying to make sense of things that disappointments, setbacks, feeling restricted in some way, feeling stuck, not able to move forward. But I think after my son died, my ability to sit with pain and suffering went to a whole nother level. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it was not as terrifying anymore, that I could sit with it and, and experience it with a person, help them experience it, not push it away or try to give a quick solution. In some ways, it kind of opened me up or deepened me, quieted me down. Maybe that's the better way to say it. How about you?
I had gone through all of my grief before I became a therapist. So, no, grief is kind of, you never go through all of it, right? There's always more to do. And so, but I agree. I think it's one of the ways that I've been able to sit with really big stuff, hard stuff, painful things. The ability for me to really be in that with someone comes from, having been so immersed in it for myself. So it's not that it's comfortable, but it's a different experience, I think, than others who have not gone through that.
I have a friend who told me right after my son died, his stepdaughter died a few years before my son, and he's one of my dearest friends. And he said to me, for those who haven't gone through this, nothing can be said. For those who have, nothing need be said. And there's a kind of fit or connection that happens when you've gone through such terrible grief. People, they can connect. And I know when I was reading your memoir, you were reflecting on similar themes, that when you would try to talk about the death of your mother, it would be a conversation stopper, but that you were drawn to people who had experienced intense loss, and you could connect with them. There was a fit there. And I wonder, if you still find that to be true for you.
I do. I think in my 20s, my identity was so intertwined with the loss of my parents. in a way that it's not so much anymore. I think I have a lot of other things in my life that make up my identity. I'm a mother now, I'm married. I have a broad scope of work that I do. So there are other things, but at the time in my 20s, I felt so connected to my grief and my loss, and I didn't know who I was outside of those things. And so for me to commune with anyone who didn't understand them, it was hard. It was difficult for me. And so I kind of just somehow sought out and enticed others who knew their own hard spaces. And I
Right.
still seem to, in a way. I'm not one for light conversation. So yeah.
But your life has incorporated so much more than just, being the child of two parents who died, right? So your life is full, and I think that's part of the transformation, that we can keep celebrating life, that it doesn't stop, that we don't have to stop, that we keep growing, we keep discovering, following our curiosities, that sort of thing. Yeah.
How long has it been since your son died?
He died in 2005, so it's been quite some time. Yeah.
What's the scope of that? What's the arc of that grief been like in those years?
I think in the beginning, I was very obsessed with his life, right? Because when somebody has cancer, you have a lot of time to sort of prepare for it, even though when somebody dies, you're never really prepared for that moment. But I went through a phase of obsession where I wanted, his work, his music to live on. And I kind of got obsessed about that, probably not in the healthiest way. And then right after he died, I think I went into a bit of a manic phase, where I couldn't settle down. My mind wouldn't stop racing. And somebody taught me how to knit. Actually, my son's girlfriend's cousin taught me how to knit. And I knit scarves, probably knit 15 scarves. And that quieted me down. And then after that, I think just sorting out, one of the things that really happened to me was started to question a lot of the things that I had taken for granted all these years, and I started trying to figure out, what is my world? What is my place? Where do I fit? So I went through a phase like that. I think I also went through a phase of kind of some disillusionment with some things that I had, sort of attached to prior to his death. And so, that's sort of been the arc. I think I did go through a phase of anger, bitterness, why my son? Why did he have to be the one to go? And then, questioning myself, could I have prevented it? Could I have done something differently?
Mm-hmm.
And then, the poetry, I think, started to help me sort of dig my way out of some of that, and to, create some way of, I don't know, carrying it maybe with a little bit more grace, or carrying it a little more lightly. But it's been difficult.
Yeah.
It has been very difficult. I see the world differently now, I think, than I did before that happened.
I think it's nearly impossible to go through a loss like that and not question everything, question spirituality and God, and why, the meaning of everything. And like you said, why your son, why you, why this life? It's so hard to not, I rarely meet anyone who doesn't question those things at some point in their grief process.
Right.
You relate to the 5 stages of grief at all?
I do. And I like the way that you structured your memoir around that, so that's really interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to think about, I'm in the bargaining section of your book right now.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think if I had that phase, because that's the one that I maybe.
Well, I think that might be the one where you're asking yourself if you could have done anything to change.
Okay, that makes sense. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've made peace with that. What parent doesn't think it's their job to protect their child from all harm, and when you can't do that, it's really unsettling. Yeah. And I think my son had a better perspective about it than any of us. Like right when he was diagnosed, he turned to me and his mom and said, do everything you need to do, because I don't want you to ever question or have any regrets.
Mm.
And then
Wow.
he talked later about how he felt like he was in the eye of a storm, that everything was swirling around him, but he was in this calm, quiet place, which is pretty stunning. I watched him go from being an adolescent to being an 80-year-old man in a really short period of time. And so in a lot of ways, that sort of gave us perspective, some hope, and reassured us that everything would be fine. Right before he died, I said, "Are you afraid to die?" You know? And he looked at me and said, "No, I'm not. I'm just curious about what happens next,"
Mm.
which was very surprising to hear. You know? So it he inspires me in that sense. You know, I want to live a life that's worthy of that perspective. And so for me, I guess the acceptance phase is saying, okay, well, how can I make my life meaningful and make a difference in the lives of others, and you know, celebrate the life that I have, that I'm given, because nobody knows when our time's up. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
I've been reading about that. This idea of acceptance of death actually helps us be more present to our life right now. I think that's important.
Yeah, I agree. I move in a lot of circles of end of life and grief, and I think that people in this space live so fully. You know, they embrace life so much as they embrace death, which I think most people don't quite realize that that's what will happen if you do really face death. It makes you very present to your life, which is a gift.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But I think acceptance and transformation, in terms of grief, you know, it's a tricky space because it's not something people can feel in the beginning of a loss.
right.
You know,
Sure.
this idea of you're going to make meaning of it someday and you're going to be transformed by your grief process and you're going to accept it. Hearing something like that in the first year, 5 years, is, I mean, what would that have been like for you, or what was that like?
Oh, I would have been furious.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, who are you to say you have no idea what you're talking about? Even if they had been on the other side. I mean, your experience still is not my experience, and you know, you're in a different place than I am right now, and so I want you to respect where I'm at. um, Finding people who do that, who really respect where you're at, is sometimes difficult. Most of the time I would hear people say, when I would say I lost my son, they'd get a really pained look on their face, big shock, and then they would say, "I just can't imagine." And I heard that over and over and over again. I really love that this organization is called Reimagine, because maybe all you can do is imagine. Maybe you don't really want to imagine because it's so terrifying. Um, yeah, so I've gone through depression and, you know, and anger and all that, and but not in any particular order. It just kind of swirls around in cycles, you know.
Mm. Yeah, I think acceptance is something that comes in layers and bits and pieces. I think we have moments of acceptance and then we're back in the throes of some other aspect of grief, and then we may have another moment of acceptance, you know. But I don't think it's a thing that comes in one big fell swoop and then we're done, right? Um, I think that's something that's so appealing about, I'm fascinated with the 5 stages, and I'm really fascinated with building on them, exploring them, expanding them, moving them around. But I do think that I'm grateful to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for starting this, you know,
Yeah,
foundation of grief and talking about it. And so kind of building on it is important. But I see so many people come into my office and wanting to talk about the 5 stages because they've heard of it. It was never that relevant until now that they've lost someone, but they always have a lot of questions, you know, like, I'm doing this wrong. I skipped one, or I'm stuck in one, or I don't get this one. And I think that the thing about them is it's so appealing because it almost seems like if they're just these 5 stages, I just need to move through them and then I'm done with this horrible pain. But that's not quite true.
no, I don't think you're ever done with it. In fact, I don't want to ever be done with it. I
Mhm.
don't want to ever lose that feeling of loss, because it honors my son. It, in some ways, it's a scar that reminds me that he was here and he made a difference. So, you know, I don't want to be in the throes, or I don't want to be stuck, you know, so that I can't move forward. but I'm okay with the sadness and the grief. I'm okay with whatever feelings show up, or at least I'm working on that. That's what I'm working on.
Yeah, I think we can contain multitudes. We can always be grieving on some level. We can always be connected to that loss, and we can still have a meaningful life and have joy and moments of pleasure in addition to all of it.
It's been interesting how the poetry, when I write about the poems now that about my son's loss, they take on a different tone. I wrote one recently in response to a friend's poem, where we were writing these braided poems where we take pieces of their poem and then knit our own poem. And so that's what I did. I'd like to share that if you don't mind.
Love it.
It kind of gets at the idea of transformation, and it's really spoken in the voice of my son. And I guess it could be a sign of the wisdom that grief teaches us, perhaps. But this one's called Angel Song by a Dying Fire. And it has an epigraph from a piece of Catherine Hastings' poem, My Burst of Imperceptible Light as I Open to the Blaze. And her poem is written in the voice of her mother right after she dies. So this is called Angel Song by a Dying Fire. Don't remember me fading or the shallow breaths at night when the diamonds arrived. My leaving, the same as arrival. This borrowed time I paid back with love and light refracted in my veins. If you learn to read that map, come find me waiting by a fire's blaze with all those songs we used to sing, imperceptible in the flame. Still, you'll hear me. I will be your favorite color dancing in the wind, a morning sun at midnight rising by the lake, just enough for you to see me and remember. Consider this moment familiar words reuniting in the heart of summer, the heat of our language simmering into a new flavor, our spirits combined. Even if your body shakes by the dying embers and you lie down alone in the cold, dark air, don't remember the masks we wore down here.
That's beautiful. So were you saying that is not something you could have written earlier on?
No way. No way.
Say more about why.
Probably because, the sadness was too heavy on me, or the fighting, the why, struggling with the why, trying to numb it out, trying to make those painful feelings go away, not accepting, not really inviting the pain to do its work. I really like that Kubler-Ross quote at the beginning of the one chapter about depression and how we need to sit with it, invite it, and let it do its work.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. You asked me how long ago I'd written Rules of Inheritance, and it's been, over a decade. And I could not write that book today the way that it's written. I was much closer to my losses and my grief then, and it's so raw in some ways. And I see it all so differently and feel so differently now.
It is raw, and I think that's part of the power of that memoir, and you writing it at that particular time, and it's vulnerable too. I mean, you were very open about your experience. So one of the questions I would have for you is, how did the people that are still around, how do they take it? Were they saying, no, that's not how that happened?
It was a mixed bag, Charles.
I'm sure.
I was very vulnerable in that book, and I did write about a lot of people, namely a lot of men that came in and out of my life. And I didn't let anyone read that book before it was published. I did ask for permission to write about them, and either they said yes or no, and I changed their name in some cases and identifying characteristics. But I had one boyfriend who was very, very excited that he was going to be in the book, and my high school boyfriend, and he was so excited and he couldn't wait, and he made me a mixed tape that harkened back to our time together, and he had given me permission to put his name in the book. And then there was another guy from college who had said, no, please don't use my name. And he seemed very hesitant about the whole thing. And then the book came out, and the high school boyfriend who had been excited was very unhappy with how everything had been portrayed, and to this day doesn't speak to me anymore. And then the other guy in college loved it so much that he asked me to change his name to his real name in the paperback version. So it was, we all have our own versions of how things happen and how we remember them and how we feel about them. You can't always make anyone happy or always aligned with what you see.
Sure. I wonder if you look back at that book, do you say, I have a different way of looking at it now?
Not in too many places, really. It's still, I feel like I kind of pared a lot of it down to a lot of simplicity. I tried to strip away a lot of things we tend to put on top of those experiences.
Sure.
I wrote many versions of that book, though, where I did need to rewrite those pieces.
Yeah. Well, I enjoy it. I enjoy reading memoir, and I'm enjoying this as much as any memoir I've ever read. So
thank you.
You did a wonderful job with it.
Thank you.
The Rules of Inheritance, everybody. Go get a copy.
We're going to open it up to questions in a few minutes if you want to raise your hand or put something in the chat for either Charles or myself. But Charles, I'm wondering, what would you say to another parent who is either about to go through the loss of a child or has recently gone through it? At this point in your journey, what do you have to offer someone like that?
Reach out for support. That's why I'm so excited about being part of 1330 Cancer Connect, because there's such a great support there, people who know what it's like, and find a safe space where you can deal with these things, because the tendency is to want to isolate, and that's not always the healthiest thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for everybody to live their very best life right now, no matter what's happening. And so find a space where you can do that.
Yeah. Tell us more about 1330.
Yeah, 1330 started when our executive director, after our executive director lost her daughter, actually right before her daughter said, if there's anything you've learned from my experience, do something to make a difference, to make things better. And so Lauren Spiker started Melissa's Living Legacy. Her daughter's name was Melissa, with the idea of creating a safe space for teens living with cancer, and began to do wellness kind of programming to create a space where teens who had cancer could have fun, could sort of look at their lives in a different context, because a lot of times what happens to the teenagers is that their friends start to pull away a little bit because they're scared, they don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
So the teens that would come to us early on would talk about how supportive that environment was. Now we've increased it to age 30 because adolescents and young adults with cancer is from age 13 to 30. That's how the medical community sort of defines that. And so we're doing some young adult programming as well, but we have support for parents. So we do some wellness, creative wellness, exercise, nutrition, all kinds of things. So just to create a community where people can feel safe and can live their very best lives. And that's the mission, to help teens and young adults with cancer live their very best lives right now.
That sounds amazing. That
It
sounds
is amazing.
Like such incredible work. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Stephen has a question. He says, Charlie, please distinguish between bitterness and disillusionment. You mentioned having gone through both. Are they the same, different? How?
Good question. I don't know. I think they're linked. You're bitter. You become disillusioned because you feel like something that you held dear maybe is not as dear as you thought it was, or you have a different kind of relationship. Although bitterness is tricky. I sometimes tell people that bitterness is like eating rat poison and hoping that the rat will die. So, bitterness can be corrosive to the person that's experiencing it. And I think disillusionment can too, because there's there can be kind of walling off. If the disillusionment turns towards illumination, towards a bigger perspective, then great. If it leads to, being stuck in bitterness, I think it can be unhealthy or can limit you. So I don't know if they're the same or they're different. I think they're linked.
I found that in my periods of bitterness, the way that I finally was able to move out of that place was to find community in my grieving, to not feel so alone, because that was what I felt bitter about, that I was going through this and other people weren't, or I had lost my mom and other people hadn't.
Right.
And when I began to be in community with others who knew that kind of grief and knew that kind of loss, I stopped feeling so bitter, and that was so healing for me.
Yeah, I think we're afraid to talk about death. We're afraid to talk about suffering. And I think finding spaces like this, where people can openly talk about it and feel okay about talking about it, does help you move out of disillusionment. I think it's disillusioning when the people that you're around who you think you would get support from pull away. That's painful. And then if you feel like you have to sort of educate them or bring them along or reassure them when you're in your grief and you're in your pain, that can increase a sense of bitterness. And so, finding a place where you can get the support you need, and then have empathy for the people who pulled away and not be so harsh or so judgmental, to say, okay, that's where they're at in their journey in life, and that's okay. And I still love them. I still care about them.
That was one of the interesting things about my book, and how people who knew me or people who were in the book, they had never really understood what it was that I had been going through and why I had been bitter or angry or acting out in certain ways. And I got a lot of feedback from people I knew who read the book that were like, oh my gosh, I did not realize what it was that was happening for you in that experience. And that was cathartic,
Yeah. Wow. Well,
Yeah.
so you were educating them in empathy in some ways, and making it easier for them to bear. But so this illustrates the point: when you can create a piece of art or some literature that communicates the human experience, you're starting to write now not only your life, but you're writing the reader's life, and the reader gets invited into it and then can deepen their compassion, deepen their empathy. And so that's a beautiful thing that happened. I get feedback sometimes when people hear my poems that they say they started to weep or cry. And I take an odd pleasure in that, just because it just means that you were able to experience your own grief and the book gave you permission. And so I think that's part of the community that you're talking about.
Yeah. How did you get through your hardest days? Those in the early years, there's just those days where it seems unbearable. That looking out at your life and thinking, I can't go my whole life with this. How did you get through those moments or days or weeks or?
Well, sometimes not so good. Sometimes, drinking too much wine, anesthetizing myself. Sometimes it was just taking care of my body, exercise, moving, doing things that I enjoyed doing, spending time with friends. But the poetry, for me, I think was the most healing, because I was able to look directly at my experience, and create something artistic, which then helped me heal. And then that became a part of the community that I joined. So I found people that were like, that poem's awesome, or write more stuff like that, or I really got a lot of that really touched me. This feels very validating, when you find good response to the work that you're doing, because it means that you're saying something that people can relate to, or you're saying something that's authentic and true, and you get some validation. People actually want to hear more of it. So that's helpful.
Yeah. What advice do you have for someone who would like to begin writing about their grief, but aren't sure where or how?
Well, I hope that there are more things like what I did last Saturday, giving people a chance to write about their experience, giving them permission to write. 2 days ago, 2 days ago, I was at 1330 and we were talking with the teens and the young adults, and I had them write 6-word memoirs. Just write 6 words about some aspect of your experience. Like when you were first diagnosed, what was that like? Write 6 words that would describe what that was like. When you found this place, when you came to 1330, write 6 words that describe what your life was like then. And so, that made it a little bit more accessible, just to put a few words down. It didn't have to be poetic. It didn't have to be, super creative. It was just writing. And then what I find is most helpful is when we start to share it. When people share it, and then there's the recognition like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. That's been my experience too. And then people start to feel safe. And I think that's the thing. I think you and I, that's what we do as therapists. We try to create a safe space where people can explore their world and not censor, not feel ashamed, and open up. And so that's kind of like what I try to do when I do writing workshops. And I'm sure Reimagine probably has some wellness programming around that very thing. So I would say take that. Writers and Books, where I teach, does things like that from time to time. So yeah.
Well, it sounds like here's another question. What do you say to people who say that pain and suffering are redemptive? Is this too a pat way of coping with profound loss?
Well, what would you say first? Let you answer that one. I'm curious how you would answer that.
I don't know. I think that I don't know. I think there's a certain amount of pain and suffering that is inevitable, but I also think that we sometimes hold on to it for as a way of holding on to the person we lost, and that's not always necessary in order to stay connected to that person, is what I've found.
So the notion of getting somebody to come up and say, hey, this can be transformative to you when you're in the midst of your suffering, what would you say to a person like that? I might have them watch Brene Brown's little short video on YouTube on empathy. Have you ever seen that? Mm-hmm. Where, there's one person who says, well, at least you didn't, at least you still have another son, or, to say those things to try to say, hey, it's not so bad, versus, I don't know what it's like for you, but I'm just really glad you're sharing it with me, and I'm here for you. Thich Nhat Hanh talked about relationship, and he said, 2 things you can say to somebody who you love. You can say, I'm here for you. First of all, I see that you're suffering. I know that you're suffering, and I'm here for you. And sometimes that's all you need to do. I'm here for you.
Yeah, people ask all the time, ask me, what do you say to someone who's grieving? And those are the things, there isn't really much more to say. But I think people get really scared and tripped up about saying the wrong thing or wanting to say the right thing. And they often say the wrong thing because they get so locked up, or sometimes nothing at all, which I think is the worst thing, is not acknowledging it.
There was a beautiful scene in your memoir. It was beautiful and painful at the same time. But the beautiful part was when one of the boyfriends said, tell me about your mother. Mm-hmm. Talk about her. Talk about her. And if anybody came up to me and said, talk about your son, talk about his life, I would feel so blessed and happy that they would ask. So, just get people to tell you their story. What's your story?
Yeah. I think so too. I think acknowledging it and opening that space for people to share and acknowledging their losses is the most important thing that you can do.
I agree.
As a final question, how do you think your son would think of how you're doing now?
Oh, that's a good one. I thought that very thing, that I asked myself that same question. Would he be okay with how I'm doing right now? I think so, because I think we would have a connection in a relationship, and we would go through whatever life would bring, and we'd talk about it and we'd figure it out. I don't know what he would say. I liked in your book, you kept asking for your mother to show up, and she didn't show up, so I can only imagine what he might say. And the thing is he would say, I don't know what he would say now, because he'd be in his 30s, he would have grown and developed in some new ways, and who knows what he would say. I like to imagine it. That poem that I read was one way that I was sort of imagining what he might say. Of course, that's just me projecting, So I don't know. It's a great question. I don't want to carry around the thought like I've disappointed him somehow, because I think that just keeps me in pain. I don't want to be there.
I can't imagine that you would. It sounds like you have created so much meaning and transformation within this, and offered something to the world in such a beautiful way that I imagine that he would be really proud of you and happy with how you are. But
That's nice to hear. Okay,
thank
I'm
you so much.
gonna go with that one. I'm gonna go with that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Charles. Where can people find you and your books?
The way you can get the book is to go to tigerbarkpress.com. So that's tigerbarkpress.com. It's not on Amazon or anywhere else. You can just get it from the small press. The other way you can find me is on Facebook or on Instagram. I don't have my own author webpage yet, so that's something I need to do. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk with you. I hope it was a treat, as Dara had initially described it, for everyone. Thanks to everyone for showing up today, and thank you to Reimagine for, as always, creating this space and hosting these conversations.
Thank you. Really, it's an honor to meet you and to have this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dara.
Oh, and I just wanted to mention, thank you so much, first off, Charles, and Claire, for that conversation. I did think it was a treat, by the way, and at moments sad treat, or I don't know what the word is, but not I mean, inspiring is probably the best word. I just wanted to mention that we have another Holding Space event next week with Kate Fagan. I don't know if you want to mention anything, Claire, about Kate.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk with Kate. That's going to be great. She has a new book out about her father, who recently died. And so it's a timely week for Father's Day coming up, those of us who are missing dads around that time. But Kate is an incredible journalist and writer, and I'm excited to have her on the show. So thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Dara.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.